The moment the trap snapped shut, it wasn't with a bang, but with a whisper. The hearing room in the Rayburn House office building was pressurized, the air thick with the kind of stale heat generated by too many bodies, too many cameras, and too much ambition packed into one space. To the casual observer watching on C-SPAN, it looked like business as usual. The mahogany dais curved around the front of the room, an imposing wooden barrier separating the questioners from the questioned. The flags stood limp in the corners. The low hum of the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the heat of the television lights. Everyone expected a fight. In fact, they had tuned in specifically for a brawl. The hearing was titled Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Policy for America's Future, a dry bureaucratic label for what was essentially a cage match between two opposing visions of America. On one side sat the established order of fiscal conservatism, represented today by Speaker Mike Johnson. On the other sat the vanguard of the progressive movement, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The galleries were packed. Reporters sat with laptops open, fingers hovering over keyboards, waiting for the soundbite that would define the evening news cycle. Staffers lined the walls, checking phones, whispering strategies. They expected shouting. They expected moral grandstanding. They expected the usual theater where politicians talk past each other for 5 minutes, clip it for social media, and go home. They did not expect silence. Mike Johnson sat at the center of the dais. He didn't look like a man preparing for a gladiator match. He looked like a university professor preparing to grade a disappointing thesis. He wore his standard glasses, a nondescript suit, and an expression of polite, almost pained patience. In front of him, there were no stacks of props, no oversized posters, no theatrical gimmicks, just a single manila folder resting shut and a glass of water. Across the witness table, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez looked ready for the fight she had been promised. She sat with the poise of someone who had spent years in the crosshairs of the media, her posture perfect, her microphone adjusted just so. She had her binders, her data points, her moral arguments about the urgency of climate change and the cruelty of income inequality. She was prepared for an attack on her character. She was prepared for an attack on her ideology, but she wasn't prepared for a math problem. The chairman banged the gavel, the sharp crack echoing through the room. The committee will come to order. Today's hearing concerns fiscal responsibility and economic policy. We will begin with questions. The chair recognizes Speaker Johnson. Johnson didn't launch into a speech. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't play to the cameras. He simply leaned forward, clasped his hands, and asked the question that would derail the entire morning. "Congresswoman," Johnson said, his voice calm, carrying a Louisiana cadence that sounded deceptively gentle. "Can you tell us, specifically, how this gets paid for?" It was such a mundane question. It was the kind of question asked in city council meetings and HOA disputes. At first, Ocasio-Cortez smiled. It was a reflexive, practiced smile, the smile of someone who believes their opponent has just missed the point entirely. She adjusted her microphone, leaning in with the confidence of someone on home turf. "Well," she began, her voice carrying that familiar, sharp clarity. "I think the premise of that question already shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how modern fiscal policy works. We aren't talking about a household checkbook here, Mr. Speaker. We are talking about the sovereign currency of the United States." She paused, waiting for him to interrupt, to argue, to fall into the trap of looking like a scold. But Johnson didn't interrupt. He just watched her. We've been over this countless times, she continued, filling the silence. Investments pay for themselves. That is basic economics. When you invest in a child's education, you aren't spending money. You are creating a future taxpayer. When you invest in green energy, you are preventing climate catastrophe, which would cost trillions. The return on investment, or ROI, outweighs the initial outlay. She leaned back, satisfied. It was a good answer. It was the answer that always worked. Johnson nodded slightly, as if he agreed. So, he said, you're saying the revenue offsets are guaranteed? I'm saying, she replied, her tone sharpening slightly, that framing this like a household budget, where you have to balance income and expenses every month, is outdated. With all due respect, that kind of thinking might make sense if you're balancing a church ledger or a small-town legal office, but this is the U.S. economy. We have levers that families don't have. A ripple of laughter moved through the Democratic side of the room. It was a dig, a subtle jab at Johnson's background. It was meant to characterize him as small-time, unable to grasp the complexities of macroeconomics. Johnson didn't flush. He didn't frown. He simply looked down at his notes, flipped a page, and then looked back up. Let me make sure I understand you correctly, he said, his voice dropping a decibel, forcing the room to listen harder. You believe that the sheer scale of federal spending removes the need for concrete offsets. That because the numbers are so big, the math changes. She shrugged, a gesture of dismissal. I believe that clinging to austerity talking points ignores reality. We can't cut our way to prosperity. So math no longer applies, Johnson stated. It wasn't a question. She laughed, a short, sharp sound. That's not what I said. It's what you implied, he replied instantly. But let's slow this down. He looked directly at her now, removing his reading glasses. The change in his demeanor was subtle, but terrifying. The politeness was still there, but the warmth was gone. You mentioned my background, Johnson said. I won't dispute it. I did manage budgets smaller than the federal government, much smaller. But in my experience, the arithmetic never changed. A minus sign is still a minus sign. Ocasio-Cortez crossed her arms. This feels like a lecture. It is, Johnson said, an education session for both of us. The murmur in the room died instantly. The chairman shifted in his seat, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure. When you say investments pay for themselves, Johnson continued, can you point to a single line item in the budget, one specific line, where that repayment occurs? Not in theory, not in macroeconomic shifts, in dollars and cents. She hesitated. It was a microsecond, but it was there. Economic growth, she said. How much? Johnson asked. That depends on the multiplier effect of the… How much? He repeated. Still even, still quiet, still relentless. She leaned forward, frustration creeping into her voice. You can't reduce complex systemic changes to a single number on a spreadsheet. That is a reductionist view of governance. I can, Johnson said. And so can the Congressional Budget Office, which is why I'm asking. The room was silent now. The scratching of pens had stopped. The cameras were zoomed in tight on Ocasio-Cortez's face. She opened her mouth to speak, closed it, and then tried a different tack. This isn't a gotcha, she said, her voice tighter. You know that these models are fluid. I know, Johnson replied. That's why I brought documents. He lifted the manila folder slightly. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He didn't wave it around. He just lifted it an inch off the table and let it drop. Thud. The sound echoed in the quiet room. This hearing can go one of two ways, Johnson said, his eyes locking onto hers. We can trade slogans. We can talk about visions and frameworks and moral imperatives. Or we can examine records. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Which would you prefer? No one spoke. For the first time that morning, the audience understood that they weren't watching a debate. Debates have two sides. This was an interrogation, and the man asking the questions had brought the answers with him. The chairman cleared his throat, the sound loud in the tense room. Speaker Johnson, you may proceed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mike Johnson said. He slid the manila folder open. The papers inside were neat, tabulated, and highlighted in yellow. He didn't look at them yet. He looked at the witness. Congresswoman, he began, you have said repeatedly, in interviews, on social media, and on the floor of the House, that large-scale spending initiatives don't require traditional funding because the growth they generate will cover the cost. That's correct, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez replied, finding her footing again. And it's supported by modern economic thought. If you look at historical precedents like the New Deal or the interstate highway system, the economic activity generated far exceeded the initial cost. Then this should be easy, Johnson said. He tapped the top page of his folder. According to this report from the Congressional Budget Office, nonpartisan, I might add, your proposal carries an estimated price tag of several $1 trillion over the next decade. Let's stick to the first year for simplicity. Where, specifically, does the offset occur in year one? She sighed, a sound of exaggerated patience. Again, you're trying to compress a decade-long transformation into a single fiscal year. That's not how investment works. You don't build a house and expect it to pay you back the next day. Year one, Johnson repeated. Where is the money? There isn't a single line, she said, her hands moving as she spoke, trying to sculpt the air into an argument. It's a macroeconomic shift. Increased wages lead to increased tax revenue. Reduced health care costs lead to more disposable income. It's a holistic cycle. So there is no repayment schedule, Johnson said. That's a simplistic way to phrase it. It's a precise way to phrase it, he answered. She leaned toward the microphone, her patience fraying. You cannot run a country like a family checkbook. The United States government can issue debt. A family cannot. The comparison is intellectually dishonest. Johnson nodded slowly. You're right. The mechanics are different. We can print money. A family cannot. He paused. But families still live with the consequences when spending outpaces income. And ultimately, nations do too. That analogy doesn't scale, she insisted. Neither do deficits, he said. They compound. A low murmur moved through the room. It was the sound of the audience realizing that Johnson wasn't just throwing out talking points, he was boxing her in. He wasn't arguing against the morality of her spending. He was arguing against the physics of it. She raised an eyebrow, deciding to go on the offensive. Is this where you tell me the sky is falling? Because we've heard the deficit hawk routine for 40 years. And yet, here we are. No, Johnson said. This is where I ask why your public statements don't match the numbers you vote for. That's an accusation, she snapped. It's a comparison, he corrected. He turned a page in his folder. The sound was crisp. Let's talk about priorities, he said. You have spoken passionately, eloquently even, about income inequality. Yes, she said, firm, because it is real. Because the gap between the rich and the poor is the defining crisis of our time. You've criticized what you call elite excess, Johnson continued. Absolutely. The hoarding of wealth by the 1% while working families starve is immoral. So, help me reconcile something, Johnson said. He picked up a document from the folder. It wasn't a CBO report. It was a copy of a campaign finance disclosure form. He slid it across the smooth wood of the table toward her. She glanced down at it, her expression flickering for a fraction of a second. These are your campaign disclosures, Johnson said. From the last cycle. He put on his glasses again to read. High-end fundraising venues, luxury accommodations during official travel, merchandise revenue in the millions. She looked up, her eyes flashing. That's not relevant to policy. That is how campaigns work in the current system. You know that. It's relevant to consistency, he replied. You're policing lifestyle now? She asked, incredulous. Because I don't wear a burlap sack? I'm asking whether the rhetoric matches the reality, Johnson said. When you say the system is rigged, but you operate comfortably within it, using the very tools of elite excess you condemn, voters deserve clarity. She shook her head, looking at the chairman. This is beneath the committee. My campaign finances are public, legal, and standard. This is a distraction. Then answer simply, Johnson said, ignoring the plea to the chairman. Do you believe personal conduct reflects public conviction? She paused. The trap was obvious. If she said yes, she opened herself up to more scrutiny. If she said no, she admitted that her values were performative. I believe, she said carefully, choosing her words like stepping stones, that people can fight injustice without taking vows of poverty. I believe that we have to survive the system to change it. I agree, Johnson said. But then, don't sell moral purity as a credential. The room went still. Speaker Johnson, the chairman warned. I'm almost finished, Johnson said. For now. He closed the folder gently. Congresswoman, he said, this hearing isn't about winning a clip for Twitter. It's about whether ideas survive contact with math, with records, and with real-world outcomes. He leaned back in his chair. And we've only just begun. No one spoke. Somewhere in the back row, a reporter stopped typing. The keys had been clacking furiously a moment ago, but now they hung in the air. The questions weren't getting louder. They were getting sharper. And the hearing, which was supposed to be about the national budget, was suddenly about something much more personal. The chairman leaned into his microphone, his brow furrowed. We will continue. A beat of silence passed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez straightened in her chair. She adjusted her blazer, a subconscious armor-plating gesture. If this hearing is going to turn into a character audit, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet, I would like that stated clearly. I came here to discuss economic policy, not to have my receipts scrutinized by someone who votes against school lunches. Mike Johnson didn't look at her right away. He was looking at his notes, circling something with a blue pen. It's not a character audit, he said, finally looking up. It's a credibility check. That's semantics, she shot back. No, Johnson replied. It's sequencing. She frowned, genuinely confused. Explain. You built your platform on moral urgency, he said. Fairness, sacrifice, the idea that we must share the burden to build a better society. That message earns trust. It resonates with people. But trust depends on alignment. With policy, she said sharply. And behavior, Johnson answered. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table. So now you're suggesting my personal life disqualifies my arguments? That because I stay in a hotel while traveling for work, I can't advocate for the homeless? I'm suggesting voters notice contradictions, he said. And today, they are noticing them in real time. A murmur rolled through the audience. Phones lifted higher, screens glowing in the dim light. She shook her head, a look of pity on her face. This is performative. You're trying to create a gotcha moment because you can't win on the issues. Johnson held her gaze. Then why are the numbers uncomfortable? She opened her mouth, paused, and then said, because you're cherry-picking. You're taking standard expenses and framing them as extravagance. Then unpick them, he replied calmly. He flipped another page in the folder. You've criticized corporate profit margins, he said. You've called capitalism irredeemable in its current form. Yet, here is your campaign merchandise operation. He held up a sheet detailing revenue. It cleared millions, high markup, production supply chains that span the globe. You are running a highly efficient, highly profitable business. That money fund's organizing, she said quickly. It goes back into the movement. We don't take corporate packy money. We rely on small-dollar donations and merchandise. That is how we stay independent. So profit is acceptable when the messaging is right, Johnson said. That is exactly what it is, he said. Capitalism with a conscience label. The chairman raised a hand. Let's keep this orderly. Johnson nodded. Of course. He turned back to her. Do you believe capitalism is inherently exploitative? Yes, she said without hesitation. In its current form, it relies on the extraction of value from labor without fair compensation. Then why rely on its most efficient tools to fund your brand? She bristled. You're trivializing systemic reform. You're acting like participating in society disqualifies you from criticizing it. I'm isolating hypocrisy, Johnson said. There's a difference. She crossed her arms. You want me to apologize for being effective? I want you to be honest about the system you benefit from, he replied. The room was quiet now. No murmurs, no coughing. A Democratic member from the back row interjected, Mr. Speaker, where is this going? Johnson didn't break eye contact with her. Two outcomes. He turned slightly, closing the section of the folder related to campaign finance. Let's move from symbolism to impact, he said. Because rhetoric is fine, merchandise is fine, but eventually, policies hit the ground. He looked back at her. You opposed a major private investment in your district. Her jaw tightened. She knew where this was going. Because it was exploitative, she said. Because it was Amazon, he said. Let's name it. Yes, she said. Amazon. 25,000 jobs, Johnson said. Average salary over $100,000. She shook her head violently. With tax giveaways, billions in subsidies given to one of the richest companies on earth. It was a handout. 0 local tax after 5 years, he countered. Net positive revenue for the city from year 2. The analysis was clear. That's disputed, she said. So are your claims, he replied. She exhaled sharply. You're reframing this. You're making it sound like I drove them away. They left because they didn't want to engage with the community. I'm grounding it, Johnson said. You claimed a victory. You took a victory lap when Amazon pulled out. And next, Johnson said, reaching for a new stack of papers. We're going to hear from the people who lost those jobs. The chairman hesitated. Speaker Johnson, do you have witnesses? Johnson closed the folder. Not yet, but I have their testimony right here, sworn statements. And that's when this stops being theoretical. No one moved. For the first time, the audience realized this wasn't about ideology anymore. It wasn't about abstract concepts of socialism versus capitalism. It was about consequences. It was about the gap between the promise of a revolution and the reality of a lost paycheck. The chairman hesitated, glancing at the clock and then back at the witness table. "Speaker Johnson, you may proceed." Johnson didn't rush. He opened the next section of his folder, the sound of the paper sliding against the wood, audible in the silent room. This wasn't about abstract economic theories anymore. This was about Queens. "Congresswoman," Johnson began, "you described the Amazon deal in your district, the HQ2 project, as exploitation. You actively campaigned against it. You celebrated when Amazon withdrew." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't blink. It was exploitation. It was a massive corporate handout to one of the wealthiest companies in human history, paid for by displacement and gentrification. "Let's hear from the district," Johnson replied. He lifted a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a statistic. It was a narrative. "This is testimony submitted to the committee," Johnson said, "from a small business owner in Long Island City. He owns a sandwich shop 3 blocks from the proposed site." Johnson put on his reading glasses. He writes, "I took out a loan to expand my kitchen. I hired 2 extra staff members in anticipation of the construction crews and the future office workers. When the deal collapsed, the foot traffic never came. I had to lay off those 2 employees within 3 months. I am currently behind on the loan." Ocasio-Cortez shook her head. "Anecdotes aren't data, Mr. Speaker. For every business owner who thought they would profit, there were 5 families facing eviction because their rent was about to triple." "Then here is more," Johnson said, turning the page. "This is from a recent community college graduate, software track, born and raised in Queens." He read, "I studied coding because I thought the jobs were coming to me. I thought I could work in tech without leaving my family. Now, I commute 2 hours a day to a help desk job in Manhattan for 30% less than the starting salary Amazon offered. The opportunity didn't just leave, it was chased away." She leaned forward, her voice rising. "You are blaming me for corporate decisions. Amazon chose to leave. They chose to take their ball and go home because we asked for accountability." "I'm describing outcomes," Johnson said calmly. "You intervened. The investment left. These are the consequences. Amazon could have stayed without the subsidies," she insisted. "They had the money. They wanted the location. They left to make a political point." "They declined," Johnson said. "That is how negotiations work. You don't get everything you want just because you demand it." "So we were supposed to cave?" she asked, incredulous. "We were supposed to hand over $3 billion in tax incentives to Jeff Bezos while our subways are crumbling?" "No," Johnson replied. "You were supposed to calculate trade-offs." He placed the testimonies on the table. "You traded 25,000 jobs," he said. "Union construction jobs, tech jobs, service jobs. You traded $27 billion in projected tax revenue over 20 years. And what did you get in return?" She frowned. "We preserved our community. We prevented displacement." "And you prevented prosperity," Johnson countered. "Which workers did you protect, Congresswoman?" "The future ones," she said firmly. "The ones who would have been priced out of their own homes." "And what about the present ones?" Johnson asked. "The sandwich shop owner, the graduate, the union carpenter who was counting on that project for his pension." The room was silent. "You're framing this emotionally," she said, deflecting. "I'm grounding it locally," Johnson said. "Policy isn't abstract to the people living under it. When you kill a deal, You don't just kill a press release. You kill paychecks, the chairman interjected. Let's stay within the time limits. Johnson nodded. One more point on this. He turned back to her. You often speak about opportunity, about the dignity of work. Yes. Then explain, he said, his voice lowering to a register that forced everyone to lean in. Why 25,000 opportunities were treated as expendable symbolism. She leaned back, her expression hardening. Because principles matter. We cannot set a precedent that corporations can hold cities hostage for tax breaks. So do paychecks, Johnson replied. Principles don't pay the rent for that sandwich shop owner. Paychecks do. A few members exchanged glances. This was the crux of the argument. It was the collision between the ideological purity of the progressive movement and the pragmatic reality of economic development. This committee isn't here to defend corporate ultimatums, she said, trying to regain the moral high ground. No, Johnson said. It is here to assess whether decisions improved lives. He tapped the paper with the testimony. These people say they didn't. She looked down at her notes, then back up. You are assuming correlation equals causation. The economy in New York is complex. I'm observing sequence, he said. Action, reaction, result. You acted. Amazon reacted. The result was a vacant lot where 25,000 jobs should have been. The chairman cleared his throat again, checking the clock. Johnson ignored him. He was building a rhythm now, a methodical dismantling of the narrative. This is the pattern we are examining today, Johnson said. What pattern? She asked, her voice tight. Rhetoric first, he said. Math later. Outcomes last. She tightened her grip on the desk. You think you're exposing something? I am, Johnson said, but not what you think. He paused, looking out at the gallery before returning his gaze to her. This isn't about Amazon, he said. It's about whether policy is judged by intent or by impact. He leaned back. And we haven't even reached the part where the numbers get truly uncomfortable. The room remained still because everyone sensed the shift. The argument was no longer theoretical. It was personal, and it was far from over. We're moving to fiscal projections, the chairman announced, trying to steer the ship back to safer waters. Mike Johnson nodded. Perfect. He leaned forward. Congresswoman, let's talk about the Green New Deal. A faint smile crossed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's face. It was a smile of relief. This was her turf. This was her signature policy. She knew the talking points by heart. I was wondering when we'd get there, she said. Good, Johnson said. Then we won't waste time. She adjusted her microphone. It's a framework, not a bill. It's a vision for the future. Frameworks still have costs, Johnson replied. According to multiple independent estimates, including the American Action Forum and others, the total price tag approaches $90 trillion over 10 years. That figure has been debunked, she said quickly. It was the standard response. By whom? Johnson asked. By economists who understand long-term transformation. Name one, he said. She paused. There are many who— Name the number, Johnson said. If $90 trillion is wrong, what is the right number? Is it 50 trillion? 20 trillion? She exhaled. You can't isolate it like this. You have to look at the cost of inaction. I can isolate it, he said, because revenue is finite. She leaned forward. You're ignoring savings. The cost of climate change, floods, fires, displaced populations will bankrupt us if we do nothing. Let's include the savings, Johnson said. Let's be generous. Let's assume your plan saves $10 trillion. We are still looking at a deficit that swallows the entire global economy. Even if we confiscated every dollar of billionaire wealth in the United States, Johnson continued, pulling a new sheet from his folder. Every stock, every yacht, every mansion, liquidated it all. It wouldn't cover half the cost of the first 3 years. That's a talking point, she snapped. It's arithmetic, he said. Total billionaire net worth versus projected cost. The numbers don't match. She shook her head. You're fear-mongering. You're trying to scare people with big numbers to protect the fossil fuel industry. I'm budgeting, Johnson replied. I'm trying to figure out how to pay the bill you want to write. The room was silent again. She spoke carefully. These investments create jobs. Millions of jobs. How many? Johnson asked. Millions. At what cost per job? He said. She hesitated. That's not how we measure. It is when the money runs out, Johnson said. The chairman interjected. Let's avoid crosstalk. Johnson nodded. Last question on this. He looked at her. Do you believe a policy that cannot be funded should still be promoted as inevitable? She crossed her arms. I believe bold ideas require courage. I believe leaders owe the public solvency, Johnson replied. She smiled thinly. You're framing imagination as irresponsibility. I'm framing promises as liabilities, he said. A member from the side muttered, That's harsh. Johnson heard it. So is inflation. She leaned back, visibly annoyed. You act like no risk is acceptable. No, Johnson said. I act like someone has to pay. The chairman cleared his throat. We'll move to closing remarks shortly. Johnson looked at her one last time. This is the part most people don't hear. She raised an eyebrow. Which part? The ending, he said. Where the bill comes due. He gathered his papers. And we're not there yet. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Because the audience understood now, this wasn't a clash of personalities. It was a collision between vision and verification, and only one of them had brought a calculator. The tension in the room was palpable. Johnson had effectively stripped away the visionary shield of the Green New Deal and exposed the raw mathematical machinery underneath. AOC was on the defensive, forced to argue against arithmetic rather than for the planet. Congresswoman, Johnson resumed, let's drill down. You mentioned modern economic thought earlier. The idea that we can print our way out of this. That is a gross oversimplification of MMT, she corrected. Perhaps, but practically speaking, to fund a $90 trillion expansion, or even a $50 trillion one, you need to raise taxes, significantly. We need to tax the rich, she said immediately. We need to make them pay their fair share. Okay, Johnson said, let's do that math. He pulled out a chart. If you tax every person earning over $400,000 at a 100% rate, take everything they earn. It doesn't fund the government for 6 months under your plan. That isn't the plan, she said. Then what is? Johnson asked. Because the middle class is where the money is. The math says you have to tax the middle class to pay for this. Do you admit that? We would lower costs for the middle class, she insisted. No premiums, no child care costs. But their taxes go up, Johnson pressed. Yes or no? It's a net benefit, she dodged. So their taxes go up, Johnson stated. Why won't you say it? Because it's misleading, she shouted, losing her cool for a fraction of a second. You're focusing on the line item of the tax without looking at the line item of the savings. I'm focusing on the paycheck, Johnson said, because that's what people see. You are asking them to trust that the government will manage their money better than they can. And given the record we just discussed, the Amazon deal, the deficit, why should they trust that? She took a deep breath. Because the alternative is planetary extinction. That is an ultimatum, Johnson said. Not a budget. It is the reality, she said. It is a sales pitch, he countered. And the price is too high. Johnson closed the section on the Green New Deal. He didn't need to scream. He didn't need to call it socialism. He just needed to show that the check would bounce. You sell the vision, Johnson said quietly, but you hide the invoice. That isn't leadership, Congresswoman. That is marketing. The chairman tapped the microphone. We have time for one final line of questioning. Mike Johnson didn't rush. He arranged his papers, closing the folders on Amazon and the Green New Deal. He picked up a single sheet of paper, printed from a GoFundMe page. Congresswoman, he said, you've spoken often about moral responsibility. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez nodded, wary but confident. Because leadership requires it. Then let's talk about responsibility when the cameras are off, Johnson replied. She stiffened slightly. Go on. You've publicly shared the conditions of your grandmother's home in Puerto Rico, he said. You posted photos of the damage from the hurricane. You used it to highlight government neglect and the failure of aid to reach the island. Yes, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Because it was unacceptable. My abuela was living with buckets catching rain because the Trump administration abandoned Puerto Rico. And it raised significant funds, he continued. Conservative commentators, people you disagree with fundamentally, started a fundraising campaign. Matt Walsh raised over $100,000 for your grandmother in hours. She frowned. I didn't ask for that. No, Johnson said. But the money was there. It was available. It could have fixed the roof immediately. And you rejected it. I rejected it because it was performative, she said. It wasn't about helping her. It was about trying to make a point about me. It came with strings. It was tainted. It was money, Johnson said, to fix a roof, for a woman living with buckets. And at the same time, Johnson continued, looking at his notes, records show you had the personal means to resolve that situation directly. You earn $174,000 a year. You drive a Tesla. You live in a luxury apartment building in D.C. That is an unfair insinuation, she said, her voice shaking with genuine anger. I support my family in many ways. You don't know my finances. I know what you disclose, Johnson replied, and I know the timeline. Fundraising appeal first, he said. Political attacks on the administration second. Repairs later. You're questioning my family, she accused. I'm questioning your choices, he said. There is a difference. The chairman shifted uncomfortably. Speaker Johnson, this matters, Johnson said quickly to the chair, then turned back to her. You rejected private assistance because it came from people you dislike, he said. And you accepted public sympathy, which came with donations to your political cause. Her voice sharpened. This is crossing a line. No, Johnson said. This is drawing one. She took a breath. I used my platform to expose injustice. I chose not to fix it privately because the issue wasn't just my grandmother. It was everyone's grandmother. So you left her in that condition to make a point? Johnson asked. The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade. I didn't say that, she stammered. You implied it, Johnson said. You said the issue was bigger than one person. So the one person, your own flesh and blood, had to wait so you could film the video. You are twisting this, she said. I'm asking why the problem remained unsolved when a solution was available, Johnson said. The room was silent again. Not tense, focused. She spoke slowly now. Public figures don't get private lives. I understand that. But I won't apologize for refusing money from people who mock my community. Then you owe public consistency, Johnson answered. A member from the back muttered, "Damn." The chairman looked at the clock. "We need to wrap this up." Johnson nodded. "One sentence." He faced her. "Do you believe ends justify means when the cause is righteous?" She hesitated. "I believe systems are bigger than individuals," she said finally. Johnson leaned back. "And I believe character shows up in small decisions." He closed his folder. "That's the difference between us." No one spoke. Not because they were shocked, but because the exchange had moved somewhere deeper than policy. The hearing wasn't about budgets anymore. It was about credibility. The chairman exhaled slowly. "We'll allow brief responses from other members." A chair scraped. "Mr. Speaker," a senior Democrat said carefully, "I think we're drifting." Mike Johnson turned slightly. "Drifting from what?" "From policy," the member replied. "This is starting to feel personal." Johnson nodded once. "Policy always feels personal to the people affected by it." Another voice cut in, sharper this time. "This line of questioning is inappropriate." Johnson looked toward the sound. "Which question specifically?" The member hesitated. "All of it. You're attacking her motives." "So no objections to the facts," Johnson said. "Just discomfort with the framing." A murmur rippled across the dais. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez straightened. "I don't need defenders." A pause. "That wasn't a defense," Johnson said. "That was an interruption." She turned to him. "You're enjoying this?" "No," he replied. "I'm documenting it." Another Democrat leaned into his microphone. "You're turning a hearing into a spectacle." Johnson tilted his head. "A spectacle requires exaggeration. I've used your colleagues' own records, own words, own filings." "That doesn't make it ethical," the member shot back. Johnson responded evenly. "Ethics committees exist for a reason. We're discussing public ones?" The chairman raised a hand. "Order." The room settled, but the shift was unmistakable. Allies who had stayed silent now leaned forward, not to attack Johnson, but to slow him. That alone told its own story. They weren't fighting for her. They were fighting to stop the bleeding. Ocasio-Cortez spoke again, more measured now. "You've made your point." "I haven't," Johnson said, "but I'm close." She narrowed her eyes. "To what?" "To the contradiction at the center of your politics," he replied. "You argue systems absolve individuals, that if the system is broken, personal choices don't matter. But you also argue individuals must be held accountable, if they are CEOs, or billionaires, or Republicans." "That's not contradictory," she said. "It is when accountability only points one direction," Johnson said. A member interjected. "This is turning philosophical." Johnson nodded. "Because governance is." He turned back to her. "When corporations fail, you name them. When policies fail, you blame systems. When personal decisions fail, you deflect." She shook her head. "That's a mischaracterization." "Then correct it," he said. She opened her mouth, then stopped. The silence stretched. A Democrat from the far end finally spoke. "We should move on." Johnson leaned back. "You can. The public won't." The chairman tapped the gavel lightly. Final statements. Ocasio-Cortez inhaled. "This hearing was supposed to be about the future." "It still is," Johnson replied. "The future depends on whether people believe what they're told." She met his gaze. "And you think this undermines me?" "I think it informs voters," he said. She looked away first. Not in defeat, in calculation. And that's when the room understood something important. The pressure wasn't breaking her arguments. It was forcing her to choose which ones to abandon. The chairman glanced down at his notes. We will proceed to closing remarks. A chair creaked as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez adjusted her posture. She knew this was her moment to reframe, to clip the ending for Instagram, to turn the loss into a win. I want to be very clear, she said, her voice regaining its strength. What we saw today wasn't oversight. It was an attempt to discredit. It was an attempt to take the focus off the crushing inequality in this country and put it on bookkeeping. Mike Johnson folded his hands over the manila folder. Oversight feels like discredit when records don't cooperate. She turned toward him. You think voters care about spreadsheets more than vision? I think voters care about whether vision survives contact with reality, he replied. A member from the side muttered, That's a line. Johnson didn't react. Ocasio-Cortez continued. Every reform movement in history faced this kind of resistance. Nitpicking, distraction, personalization. They told FDR we couldn't afford it. They told JFK we couldn't go to the moon. And every failed one ignored warning signs, Johnson said. She shook her head. You're afraid of change. No, he said. I'm afraid of pretending math is optional. The chairman raised his hand slightly. We're running out of time. Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward. Then let me say this. The future isn't built by people who ask permission from old systems. Johnson nodded. It's built by people who understand limits. She smiled thinly. Limits are artificial. Debt ceilings aren't, he replied. A few members exchanged looks. No one interrupted now. She took a breath. You've tried to paint me as inconsistent. I've let the record speak, Johnson said. And you think this ends here? No, he replied. I think this starts conversations you can't control. And the room went quiet. The chairman cleared his throat. Speaker Johnson, final comment. Johnson didn't look at the cameras. He looked at her. This wasn't about embarrassing you, he said. It was about something larger. Which is? She asked. What happens when rhetoric becomes immune to verification? He said. When slogans replace solvency. When followers replace facts. She crossed her arms. You think you won? I think the public learned, Johnson replied. The chairman lifted the gavel. This hearing is adjourned. The sound echoed longer than usual. Bang. No applause, no chatter. Just chairs sliding back slowly. Ocasio-Cortez gathered her papers without looking up. Her movements were sharp, efficient. Johnson did the same, stacking his documents back into the folder with the care of a librarian. As cameras powered down, a reporter whispered to another, She didn't answer the last question. Another replied, She couldn't. Johnson paused at the aisle. He turned once more, looking back at the empty witness chair. He said quietly, almost to himself, Silence is an answer, too. And in that moment, the most revealing exchange of the day wasn't spoken into a microphone. It was the absence of a rebuttal. Because the question everyone had been waiting for, how does this get paid for, wasn't answered. Not yet. And it wouldn't be until the very end. The hallway outside the hearing room buzzed the moment the doors opened. The heavy wood swung back, and the noise of the press corps rushed in like a wave. Congresswoman, over here! Speaker Johnson, quick question. Cameras surged forward, lenses vying for position. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stopped first. She knew the game. Get the soundbite out first. Define the narrative before the clips went viral. This hearing confirmed exactly what people are tired of, she said, her voice steady, projecting confidence. Deflection instead of solutions. We tried to talk about climate change, about housing, about the future. And they wanted to talk about accounting errors. A reporter pressed in. Do you regret any of your answers? She paused half a second too long. No, she said. Not even on the cost projections. I've been clear. Transformational change doesn't fit neatly into old accounting models. Another voice cut through. Why didn't you answer the question about offsets? She turned sharply. Because it was asked in bad faith. Then she moved, her staff clearing a path to the elevators. Down the hall, Mike Johnson was still standing by the committee door, unhurried. He held the manila folder at his side. Mr. Speaker, a journalist called out, was today political theater? Johnson shook his head. Theater has scripts. I brought receipts. Are you accusing her of hypocrisy? I'm accusing policy of needing proof, he replied. A staffer leaned in. Sir, leadership wants to know if you're satisfied. Johnson didn't look away from the reporters. Satisfied isn't the goal. Clarity is. A reporter stepped closer. Do you think you changed minds? Johnson considered the question. I think some people heard things they can't unhear. Across the hall, Ocasio-Cortez stopped at the elevators. A junior aide whispered, That got rough. She nodded slightly. They're trying to reframe me. Did it work? She didn't answer immediately. We'll see. The doors closed. Inside a side office, Democratic members gathered quickly. He went too far, one said. But the numbers landed, another replied quietly. A third shook his head. Social media is already clipping it. Back down the hall, Johnson spoke with a senior Republican aide. You realize they'll come after you for this? The aide said. Johnson nodded. They already are. Worth it? Johnson glanced back toward the hearing room doors. If you don't draw lines, you don't know where you stand. Outside, clips were already circulating. Not the jabs, not the tone, the pauses, the unanswered questions. A producer whispered to a colleague in a control room in Manhattan. She never closed the loop. The colleague nodded. And he never raised his voice. That contrast was spreading faster than any argument. Because the audience wasn't debating ideology anymore, they were replaying the silence. And in politics, silence after a simple question can be louder than any speech. Later that night, the cable news cycle spun up. Commentators leaned forward, trying to dissect the meaning. One anchor opened the segment. What we saw today wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. But it's still unfolding. A clip rolled. Johnson's voice, calm and steady. Do you believe a policy that cannot be funded should still be promoted as inevitable? The screen froze before the answer. That pause is everything, another panelist said. Cut to a different studio. They expected fireworks, someone said. Instead, they got arithmetic. Back on the Hill, Mike Johnson sat alone in his office. A staffer stood by the door. They're asking if you want to respond to her statement, the aide said. Johnson shook his head. I already did. With what quote? With the questions, he replied. Down the street, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez met with advisers. He boxed you in, one said carefully. No, she replied. He slowed the room. Another added, People are saying you didn't land the ending. She looked up. Endings are overrated. Not in politics, the aide said. They remember the last unanswered thing. She leaned back. We'll reframe. How? With vision. Back on television, a commentator shook his head. Vision isn't what trended. What did? The moment she stopped talking, the clip rolled again. Do you believe ends justify means when the cause is righteous? Silence. A different panelist leaned in. Here's the thing. This wasn't about her losing. What was it about? Exposure, he said. Not of ideology, of method. Another voice cut in. He never accused her directly. No, the panelist said. He let the contradictions introduce themselves. In Johnson's office, the aide checked his phone. They're calling it a dismantling. Johnson didn't look up. I never touched her. Then what did you do? I held the mirror steady, he said. Across town, Ocasio-Cortez stood to leave. An aide asked, What's the takeaway? She paused at the door. The fight continues. Outside, the anchor delivered the final line of the night. Today wasn't about who won an argument. It was about who answered the questions and who didn't. The screen faded to black, and only then did the audience get the answer they had been waiting for all along. Not spoken, not shouted, but revealed in the space where a response should have been.